go ahead and get started. We may have some other people join us, but thank you everyone for being here this morning. We're excited to see you next week in person, but wanted to do this presentation virtually so that we can also record it for anyone who's unable to attend in person, since it is a mandatory session. So I see a question. Actually, we will share information if you missed yesterday's presentation, or if you have to miss this one for any reason. If you're seeing this later, this will be recorded. We'll share this out, so you'll be able to come back and rewatch the content or watch it for the first time if you missed it. Joining us today is Joseph Brown. He's going to talk about academic integrity. And Joseph, I'm going to let you talk about what academic integrity is and what that all means, but it's a really important session, so please make sure you pay attention. And thank you so much, Joseph, for joining us.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Bronwyn. So good to be with you all today, and been watching the salutations and good morning messages, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're beaming in from right now. And just wanted to say hello to everyone. Glad to be with you this morning. My name is Dr. Joseph Brown. I serve as the director of the Academic Integrity Program here at CSU. And this session is particularly important for our international students who come from different preparations, and particularly, maybe different academic traditions where the rules might be, and the expectations might be slightly different. And we want to make sure that you're aware of kind of like what this might look like here in the United States. So when we talk about academic integrity, generally speaking, we're talking about how you complete academic work on our campus and on your campus. And what we mean by that is we use the phrase authentic engagement with learning material. In other words, if your instructor and professor assigns an assignment, the expectation on our campus is that what you turn in is your work. And when that work is accentuated or developed with the ideas of someone else, in other words, you've used research, we expect that you account for that and acknowledge it appropriately. I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. So the topics that I've prepared for you today are based on some kind of common themes that we've seen over our years of doing this with students who come from international backgrounds. And they were shared with me by the folks who organized this panel. But I also want you to know that you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the conclusion of this presentation. So you can absolutely do that. And if you want to go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A in Zoom, that's great. We'll get to them. If you just want to wait until we get to the end and ask your question live, that's great too. I just wanted to begin with the picture of the oval. Obviously, it's snow covered right now. So I'm sharing the picture mostly because I'm looking forward to weather when it's a little warmer and we can see the grass and the ground again. So, I'm originally, by the way, just to share, I'm originally from Georgia in the southern United States. And so I am just constantly, amazed and in a sense of wonder of all the cold weather here in the winter. And so I'm still, even though after 6 years, I'm still getting used to it. So maybe you can share some of that as well. So I'm going to scroll down to this first slide. This first slide is one of our most common questions. And so what you should see here is a slide about citations versus plagiarism. So one of the confusing things about the American system is our expectation that all ideas that you did not generate have to be acknowledged. And I wanted to share just a short story, just an anecdote from a moment I had at a conference as a graduate student years ago. I was having lunch and the student was from New Zealand. And I remember he was sitting across and we were just kind of, meeting each other and just kind of talking about the conference. And he said, one of the things that surprises me is just the emphasis, the importance Americans place on plagiarism. And he said, if an idea is valuable, shouldn't we be sharing it? And I thought that is a really interesting way of, his perspective was really interesting. His way of thinking was interesting. And I thought, yes, that's absolutely, we want to share that. The difference is we are really careful about how we share those ideas so that the people who generated them, who created them, get credit for that, right? And we also are showing that we can manage multiple big ideas in our work and distinguish between someone else's idea and ours. So the expectation here is that anytime you use the ideas or work that's created by someone else, you must acknowledge it. And so when we're talking about writing, we're talking about citation. So that could be in-text citation. In other words, parenthetical citations where you list, in my tradition, so I was originally an English professor, we use a format called Modern Language Association format. And it has a certain set of rules for where the author's name needs to appear, what should appear after the author's name. So for an example, it would be a page number from the original document, or it might be some information about how to find that source online. But we have a specific set of rules for how that should look in the paper, okay? But you'll also notice that, like in many presentations that you'll encounter on our campus, people have listed photo credits. Now you'll notice on mine, I don't have any photo credits because all of these photos are mine. But if I pulled these photos from online, I would be responsible for noting that those belong to someone else. Someone else took that photograph. So I wanted you to be aware of the different kinds of settings where you might need to do citation work. If you're giving an oral presentation in class, then you would need to make, in your speech, make reference to the source that you are using or the author's work that you're using. I want to kind of just take a moment here and just say, this is not, this is only related to work for credit. So when you're in discussion in class, you don't necessarily have to be a reference machine, right? Now you can, I think, if you're sharing an idea, you need to make sure hey, well, I read this article, or when I read the article, I noticed that the author said X, or I noticed they said Y. But I don't want you to think that the second you step in our classroom, that everything that you say is going to be judged for that, for meeting the standard. It mostly has to do with the work that you submit. Now, plagiarism comes in when that doesn't happen, okay? And so plagiarism is the kind of umbrella term, and I'm going to give you all definitions of our student conduct code in just a bit as it pertains to academic integrity. But plagiarism occurs when we don't provide information about where that work came from, and it's clear that it's not ours, okay? And so that can take a couple of forms. It can be, I think generally when people think of plagiarism, they think of someone purposefully using someone else's work instead of theirs, right? So it might be, using a paper from another source, maybe something a student found online. It may be using partial amounts of that paper in their own work and not giving credit. Or as we've seen this year, using an AI, an artificial intelligence generated section of text from a source online. So when we think about plagiarism, I think it's best to think of it really scaled down to something appeared in your paper or in your work that should have been attributed to someone else, and that did not happen, right? So it could be accidental as well. I mean, it could be just, what we would call sloppiness or laziness in doing that work, where, there's there in a given paragraph, you might have some of your ideas, but then there might also be the ideas of another author, and you didn't really, the student didn't really delineate whose work is whose. So those are the kind of basic differences here between citations and plagiarism. And this connects very very strongly with topics of, how we want you to engage with your professors in the classroom. We use the phrase courage in the classroom, but what we mean by that, it's a shorthand for, we want you to get used to asking your instructor, how do you want this work done? what is the citation expectation for this course? Like what's the format you use? And by the way, this can be kind of complicated because if you're in an English literature course and then you go across campus and you're in a computer science course, those expectations will be different. So what I want you to do is get comfortable with asking and carving out like a space where you can find out the information that you need to know that. I'm going to move down here, and this is the second. So in this next slide, I'm talking about working together versus cheating. So again, I'm going to show you the definition of these in just a moment. But generally speaking, when we talk about cheating, we don't mean like a broad umbrella term of academic dishonesty. What we mean is unauthorized collaboration. So in other words, students who work together on an assignment, on something for credit, but we're not authorized to do that. So I wanted to give you a quick list of maybe the differences of when working together is okay and when it becomes cheating. So working together means when that's approved, when that's okay, it's approved by your instructor. Okay, so the instructor knows that you're working together and is okay with it. And that's going to be different depending on what class you're in. That's one of the things that makes it really difficult to teach about this issue and for students to kind of wrap their heads around it sometimes, because you can leave your class at 11 a.m. and walk across campus and enter another classroom from another discipline. So I could leave an English class and go to that computer science class. And suddenly, when I was in English class, I was working with a partner to do peer review and look at each other's work and share ideas about what's working in those essays and what is not. And then when I go to computer science and I'm working on code, suddenly the expectation is different. The expectation is I am not allowed to work together, right? It just depends on the course. And so I want you to be aware that when you're allowed to work together, your instructor will tell you, hey, this is group work, or this is something you're going to do with a partner. It would be specific to an assignment. So you should not assume that if a instructor tells you it's okay to work together, that it means it's okay in everything. So if they allow you to work together on a project, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can work together on an exam or a written project. It's usually specific to an assignment because it's tied to what they want you to learn. The last point I wanted to point out about working together is that studying, getting together to share ideas about the course material and really drive home what you've learned, really commit it to memory. That is always okay. Studying together is okay. And the difference there is when you're studying the material, that is not working on work for credit, right? So that's different than getting together to complete a homework assignment. That would be a very different kind of getting together, right? A very different type of collaboration. So, we could take a step back and we can see then cheating would be unapproved by your instructor. In other words, it's not your instructor's responsibility to tell you all of the situations where it's not okay to work together. Let me say that again. It's not their responsibility to tell you every instance that you can't do it. It's their responsibility to tell you when it is approved. So if you haven't heard that it's approved, you should assume it's not. Does that make sense? Cheating generally occurs. The rule on our campus is that cheating occurs on work for credit, or what we call graded work. So it's for example, that's what I was saying just a moment ago. That's how we distinguish it from studying together, right? If you get together and you have a homework assignment and you complete it together, that would be considered cheating unless it was approved by your instructor. And that also includes collaboration in any form on graded work where it's not allowed. So that could be sharing a previous version of an assignment, or sharing a model that you found online, or sharing a document that you found online, or it could be signaling during an exam. It could be any kind of collaboration during an exam or any kind of completion of graded work that is not approved by your instructor. So those are the kind of the delineation between those two things here. On one hand, you have these opportunities to work together, and then we need to know where that line of work of successful and authorized collaboration is. where it becomes cheating. And generally you can tell that because you've crossed the line into something that is graded and it hasn't been approved that you can work on it. Okay. I do want to talk about CSU's general expectations for how you do your work here. So a CSU student should do their honest work every time. So in other words, authentic work, your own work every time. That should be the expectation. We also expect that when you encounter research, when you're asked to do research on a project or a written project, that, you know, we want you to interact boldly and ethically with the ideas of others. In other words, we want you to get really good at being able to distinguish between, you know, this author said this, and this author said this, and I think this, right? That's one of those skills that we really want you to work on. We also recognize that when we talk about integrity, making the right decision, choosing honesty, that we're asking you to do it often under very challenging circumstances. And those circumstances generally have to do with things that are happening outside the course. So what I mean by that is, you know, look, being an international student, being someone who is maybe new to our campus, new to your campus, that is can raise a stress level, right? And you know, you're having to manage all kinds of things that students who are just from like Loveland down the road in the town just nearby really don't have to deal with, right? And those things can raise your level of anxiety and stress, and it makes it hard sometimes to think about, you know, choosing the right way to do things, right way to do work. Now I know when I'm speaking to you all, many of you are just like, well, that's not really hard at all. And I understand that. I always would say that, you know, generally when I see students who have cheated or have plagiarized or have broken the rules on academic integrity, and somehow what I hear, the story they tell me is they were exhausted. They were behind. They didn't understand the material, right? They were looking for a shortcut because they have all of this other work to do. And I sympathize with that because we're asking students to do a lot. But what I try to drive home is we need to be aware of those moments, that they're going to be challenging moments for us as students here. I also say, excuse me, that, you know, we want our students to understand that doing the right thing isn't a technical problem. It's a character trait. We want you to think of this as part of who you are, right? You're going to do things the right way here. And what I mean by it's not a technical problem, you know, when I think students get really worried about where things go in a works cited list, right? How to do a citation, how it should look on the PowerPoint, right? Where does the author's name go? What's the page number? That sort of thing. You know, I taught for 6 years, and I will tell you that every time I received a batch of essays, what I looked at when I looked at their works cited page was, did they try? Did they try to get it right? You know, and if they did, great. If they misplaced something, it was in the wrong area of the citation, that's something I could teach. That's something I could help them with. The desire to get it right is the thing that we're most concerned about. And then lastly, I just want you to be aware that when you know, I think many students, when they hear my presentation, they say, this is not a problem for me. You know, I get it. I'm going to do my own work. I'm doing it the way it should be done. Great. This is now an opportunity for you to share that with your fellow students, to share it with your fellow students, you know, your friends. Help them understand that this is an expectation you have of yourself, and that's the way we do things at CSU. Now, I mentioned the rules. So when I say the rules, what I mean is the Student Conduct Code covers many different areas of student behavior on our campus, okay? So it covers things all the way from academic integrity to behavior in the dorms and behavior downtown and legal matters, right? So the area that let me come back. My finger hit the wrong button. Okay, there we are. The area that is designed for academic integrity, that covers our rules for academic integrity, can be broken up into 5 areas. And 2 of them we've already talked about: cheating and plagiarism. And these are, by the way, short, like truncated, condensed versions of those definitions. And I invite you to go find the Student Conduct Code and look through it, because ultimately, as a student at CSU, you are bound by those rules and expectations. But the third, fourth, and fifth one here on this list might be something that you haven't heard very much about. Unauthorized possession, that's a shortened title for unauthorized possession of an academic material. So that generally means selling, purchasing, or stealing exams or materials not authorized by the teacher, but it also means like using them in the work. So that generally what we mean by that is when students when they're trying to complete an assignment might, Google something online, might get a previous version of the assignment, or might use one of these third-party services like Course Hero or Chegg or something. There's a new one every year, but something like that. And when students use those, they often are in danger of being cited for unauthorized possession, because what inevitably happens is they use that material then in their own work, and it becomes an academic integrity issue. So my recommendation, and I have a slide on this later, is my recommendation is do not use Chegg, do not use Course Hero or any of these third-party sites. Do not use online tutoring. We have tutoring services on campus where people are trained to do it the right way. We have resources on campus to help you if you're having trouble, completing an assignment. And I'll talk more about those in just a moment. Falsification has to do with anything that you say in your in your academic work that is untrue. So that generally involves advising documents. And I would say that, like, when I have seen this happen, it has involved international students, and just kind of, trying to make sure that they understand that those documents, they accurately reflect, their transcript accurately reflects their grades and how far along they are at the university. But it can also mean something as simple as when we use clickers in our large lecture sections to prove that we're in class that day. So if you have someone take your clicker, for example, and go into class and click in for you, or do the daily, the buzzer beater question of the day to prove that you were there, and you were not there, then that would be considered falsification under the Student Conduct Code. That's just one example. The last one is facilitation. In other words, as a student, you help someone else commit academic misconduct, right? So it might be sharing something that shouldn't be shared. It might be during an exam behaving in a way that helped another student, signaling like, hey, this is no question 2, right? It's A, or something, whatever. It could be something as simple as that. But we wanted you to know that sharing the information, helping other people, that can also be considered academic misconduct. So what can happen? Well, if you're found what we call responsible for academic misconduct, this is a list of the kinds of consequences you could expect to see if you're found responsible. We use that word instead of guilty. When a student's found responsible, the most likely thing that's going to happen is they're going to receive a grading penalty. That grading penalty is dependent on the instructor. The instructor sets what they think is appropriate for that, and it can change depending on which class you're in or what assignment it is. It's most likely, from our history, generally means the student will fail the class, because the most common grading penalty is a 0 on the assignment. So you think about most of the larger assignments in our courses, well, they're pretty weighted in the course. And so getting a 0 on a large assignment generally means you fail the course. Then in many cases, you would have a student would have a disciplinary standing attached to their disciplinary record. Now, that's different than your academic record. Your disciplinary record and your academic record are 2 different things, and sometimes they interact, but mostly they're separate. So the most common thing that would happen is that you would have a disciplinary standing like disciplinary probation, loss of good standing, suspension, and maybe even expulsion. And the other most common thing that you would see would be an educational sanction. An educational sanction would be a tutorial or a reading and writing assignment, any kind of activity that the Student Resolution Center would have you complete, that's our conduct office, would have you to complete after you were found responsible, to show that you had given an opportunity to learn from this activity. And then you would submit that, and then that would be part of the consequences that you would see. But we, the university also suspends students for academic misconduct that could occur. There can be a notation on transcript, which is permanent. And of course, expulsion and revocation of a degree are also possible outcomes. And one of the last things I want to talk to you about is courage in the classroom. And what we mean by that is we want you to think about avoiding many of these issues that could arise from just not knowing by engaging with the community of the class, and particularly with your instructor. And so one of the things I recommend is that at some point, I want you to connect with your professor or instructor and make sure they know who you are. I was watching a number of students say good morning, and I noticed that there was a student from Ghana. And I remember I was in a number of political science classes with a student from Ghana when I was an undergrad at the University of Georgia. And I will never forget that one of my fellow students, his name was Hope. And I remember Hope because he was very vocal in our class and he asked questions. He introduced himself. He shared his experiences. And I remember him, as just kind of like this model student, just because he is engaged, because he wanted the professor to know who he was. He was an active participant in his own learning. And so one of the things I would recommend is at some point early in the semester, connect with your professor. That could just be a few minutes after class. It could be, dropping by office hours, but taking a moment to make sure that you have a chance to introduce yourself, make sure they know who you are, and just, kind of set the groundwork for a relationship that will benefit you in that course. I also recommend that if you know that you don't know something, like an assignment is coming up, or something is due, or there's a way that something has to be done that you don't understand, please ask. I think that one of the things I often share about my time teaching was I wanted to help students understand that there's a difference in expectations of what they think is happening and what I think is happening when they ask questions. So one of the things I explained was, one of the things I commonly tell my students is this: when you ask a question and I'm the instructor, I don't think, oh my goodness, that student doesn't know this. Oh, man, what a slow student. I have never thought that about a student. And I don't think any of our faculty do. What I always thought about them was, this is a student who cares. This is a student who wants to know. And that is something I really valued. And frankly, I think most of our students are kind of more concerned about what their peers think. And I want to be honest, I think most of their peers are kind of thinking the same thing, that, oh, this student just, wants to know more about that, and generally doesn't think much about it. So what I would say is, if you don't know something, in other words, if you don't know when something's due, or you don't know how it has to be completed, or you don't know what resources are allowed, or you don't know, what format style you're supposed to use, ask. You can do that a number of ways. You can do it in person, you can do it over email, but please just ask. I also think that you should plan to make office hours for your instructor at least once this semester. You may not know this, but your faculty members are actually required to serve office hours a certain number of hours a week. And most of them will never see a student. Students just don't come by. It is one of the biggest untapped resources we have on campus. Your professor is literally sitting in their office waiting for you to come by and ask, or get help, or show them something about what you're doing in the course and get their feedback. They are there for you. So what I would recommend is plan to make office hours at least once this semester. And that might be an opportunity for you to introduce yourself and, share about, your background and your excitement about the course. The last thing I would say is, don't assume you can use a resource found outside of class, right? So in other words, if you find a solutions manual or some sort of worksheet or previous version of the assignment, don't assume just because it's out there that it can be used. In many cases, just because it's there, it's actually the opposite. The instructor just has a really hard time. Many of our instructors have a hard time tracking down where all of these documents exist. And so what they do then is when it shows up in your work, it becomes an academic misconduct issue. So you can also just ask, if you find a resource outside of class, like let's say it's on the internet, or like you can say, hey, I found this and it seems really helpful. Is it okay if I use this and share it with them? And they can say, hey, thumbs up. Yeah, you can. That seems fine to me. Or thumbs down. No, I think this is probably something that's not going to help you and you shouldn't use it. So if you give them that opportunity, then you'll always be kind of in the zone where you're engaging in acceptable behavior. So some of those questions might be to when you interact with your faculty member, when is it okay to work with students, or is it at all? Right? Some classes the answer will be no, but you need to get an answer to that question. Another question would be, what citation style do we use in this class? Right? Your instructor will probably put that information in the syllabus, but if they don't, you should ask. And then one of the more general questions I think is really important is to say, what are your expectations for how I do work in this class? In other words, is it okay to collaborate, to use other resources, to bring things in from other research, or do I need to know something specific about your class and what your expectations are? That gives your professor an opportunity to say, I want you working on your own the entire time. Or yes, peer work is important. It gives them an opportunity to really kind of build that out for you and help you understand it. Okay. And generally, I wanted to say, we highly recommend that you do not use Chegg, Course Hero, Quizlet, or GroupMe as it relates to like work in your class or the sharing of work in your class. We highly recommend you do not use third-party homework helper sites. And I just generally, look, I want to tell you this, it's not a game. It's not a game. There may be moments where students use these sources and aren't held accountable, but I'll be honest with you all, they're very rare. In fact, most of what I'm seeing, most of what our university sees gets caught because frankly, these sources have been out there for a while, and our faculty are pretty aware of how these work at this point. And because of that, I find students misunderstand. They think that these sources are somehow authorized by the university. They're not. And I think generally it's a very quick way to get in trouble for academic misconduct at our university. I also want you to be aware that if you join a courses GroupMe, sometimes students build those on their own and they'll include everyone from the class. If you join one, you are responsible for your involvement in what appears in that chat. So if suddenly you're in that and someone gets access to an exam and shares information, you could be held accountable for seeing that. So you need to be aware that if you sign into something like that or you use GroupMe, that you could be suspected of using that information in your work. So my recommendation is you either don't involve yourself in a courses GroupMe, or you watch it closely to find out what is appearing in that GroupMe chat. And if the information, if it starts to become a place for people to share answers, you need to get out of it because you can be held accountable for it. So instead, seek out tutoring, right? There are multiple places on our campus where tutoring is free, it's just free. And it's specific, people are trained to help you in the best way. Go to office hours, as I said earlier, and then use the resources that CSU provides for free. There's a writing center, for example, right? There are multiple tutoring centers, departments have tutoring. There are many things, and you can just simply ask your instructor, where can I find help on this subject? And they'll tell you, they'll point you in the right direction. Okay. And so that leads us to the end. We have a website, which is the TILT site. So TILT is the Institute for Learning and Teaching on our campus. You can access the academic honesty and integrity page by using that website. You can just go to colostate.edu and type in TILT and navigate your way there. There's lots of stuff there for our students. but I want to stop now. I saw that we have a question. That's great. I'm going to scroll all the way back here to the top, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
You have someone working on a question, I think
Okay,
you
great.
saw. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So I see a question about where can we find CSU's resources. I can send you that right now. So I can send you, let's see, I'm going to type this answer here into the Q&A. So our site is divided between faculty resources and student resources, and there's some crossover. There's also some information across campus that has to do, that's provided by, like, for example, the Writing Center. I'll also put this in the chat. See, I think that might have just gone to the panelists. So I'm going to type that again. Okay. Okay. Okay, we have
If
some
you're
questions.
looking for the recording, we will send it out and we'll also post it on our orientation page. And I think we're waiting. Hamad, do you have a question?
Okay, so I think this might be Hamad's question, and if it's not, Hamad, please let us know. If someone was to leak an exam and I left the chat afterwards, will I still be responsible? You know, that's a good question. So I think partially, so I think you're talking about GroupMe, and I think you know, or a communication program like GroupMe. Like maybe like WhatsApp or something like that, that includes everyone from the class. If someone shares that information and you are like, whoa, that's not okay, I don't want to be involved in this, and you exit, I think the next question that the faculty member is going to have will be, does anything from what was shared appear in that student's work? In other words, like, is there information that was shared with the group that ended up in that student's submission? And I think that, you know, I think one, it looks good that you left the chat. I think that it's, you know, that might be a point of, you know, clarification for you when you're talking to a faculty member. I would say it's probably like unlikely if you left a chat that you would be called into it as a, you know, suspected of academic misconduct. But a lot of it just has to do with what appears in the exam. And if so, if there's like our faculty look for answers that are what we'd say, you know, specific to information that's shared. And if that suddenly like appears in your work, then you might have a conversation with that faculty member, but it doesn't necessarily mean you would be guilty or anything like that. I think that if anything, it would probably just be a conversation and would give you an opportunity to say, hey, I saw that happen and I thought that was not okay, so I left. So Abdul Aziz shared, I need clarification about joining any group on social media with my classmates. What I mean is when we create a group to discuss everything about the class, but not share anything else, is that okay? Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine. I think these things generally are a problem when students are sharing answers, okay? Sharing assignment completion information. In other words, like, here's how I did the homework, guys. Or here's what was on the test. I just took it 5 minutes ago. Here's what was on it. That used to be a kind of a problem with the way that exams were not timed But in most cases, if you're in a chat group and you're just kind of like sharing information that it's kind of like a way of like continuing studying, I suppose, of, like, hey, when's that due? Or, hey, what did he talk about? I missed today. What did he talk about in class? That sort of thing. That sort of thing is fine. It's when students, share information that shouldn't be shared, that's a problem. And just kind of follow up with Hamad's question about using info from a leaked exam or assignment. Yeah, if you don't use the information, if you're not like aware of it, or you saw it and you're like, oh, okay, not a thing I need to be seeing, and it doesn't appear in your work, then there was no like help, if that makes any sense. So that wouldn't generate an academic misconduct question. Okay. All right, any other academic integrity related questions?
Did you get all of the ones in the Q&A?
I think so. I just haven't clicked answered.
Okay. That's okay.
Oh, there is a question from Joy about writing tools. That's a really good question, Joy. That is a really good question. So Grammarly is kind of like an AI inspired or assisted program, right? And I want to be really clear. There are programs out there, especially right now, that will just write work for you. Like if you type in the prompt, it'll write it. It's not great, and I definitely don't think you should ever use them. But they exist. That's a different thing than what Grammarly is. Grammarly kind of works kind of like what I see Outlook doing now, or email programs, where it's kind of trying to predict what you were going to say anyway. Or it might take a look at what you've written and recommend, like Microsoft Word does, hey, this sentence is wordy, so maybe revise it, right? The thing about using Grammarly, I will tell you, I don't think it rises to the level of an academic misconduct concern yet, because ultimately you have to make the decision to change what you're writing to what it's suggesting. But I would say this about Grammarly. Like, I'm an English professor, okay? I used to teach writing. How you write, there's the belief that how you write is very much tied to your individual way of communicating. Like, it's almost like connected to your soul, like the way you interface with the world, the way you talk and the way you communicate is you and unique to you. My problem with Grammarly is it takes that away. And it takes it away because it has this kind of like algorithm that for some reason thinks that it is more professional or smarter sounding. As a writing professor, I always wanted just to see how a student thought through something. I wanted to hear their own thoughts on what was being said. And I think that generally what we see with Grammarly and other services like that is we get kind of, as a writing instructor, I would use the word pretentious or stilted language. In other words, language that doesn't really sound like my student. It sounds like my student trying to sound smart. And I think some people think that that's like a thing you'd want, but actually what happens is it gets in the way of communicating what it was you were trying to say in the first place. So that is a long way of saying, I think you should be very suspicious of services like Grammarly. And I think that you should instead focus on crafting your own inner voice and writing voice. By the way, let me just say one more thing about, let me share one more thing about connecting with your instructor and your professor. I really want you to get comfortable letting your instructors know when things are going on with you. So in other words, if you get behind, go ask for more time. That's okay. They can just say no, and you have to live with that answer, but you'd be surprised how often they'll say yes. And I think that if you share about what's going on, hey, I really want to do great work on this project, but these are the things that are holding me up right now. Could I have another day to work on it? I believe they will work with you on those. And I will tell you this story. It's a short one. I was teaching literature at a small college in Georgia, and one of my students came to me, and he was an international student, and he said, I need more time on my essay. And I said, well, can you tell me more about that? Like, why? And he said, because I'm from Mali, and there was a coup in my country last weekend, and we cannot find my father, and I'm very worried. And I said that was like literally the best excuse I've ever heard. But he was comfortable enough in my class to come to me and share with me something very personal that was going on. And the good news was, his father was just out of communication for a couple of days when everything kind of fell apart. And then he was fine ultimately. But that was obviously, the student was very worried. And I would not want that student to try to write my essay in the middle of that kind of anxiety and stress. And so I said, of course you can have time. And I appreciate that the student was just a human being with me in that moment and said, here's what I need, and allowed me an opportunity to be a human back and say, I'm happy to grant that extra time. So I would just say, let's get comfortable talking to your professors. They are real people, and sometimes they may give you an answer that you didn't want to hear, but there's never any harm in asking.
Joseph, do you know if a student is having an issue and they're unable to get the help from their professor, or they feel uncomfortable? Student case management is also a great resource that they can use to help provide that sort of liaison between the student and whomever they're experiencing the issue with.
Yes, absolutely. And there's also conflict resolution services that is attached to the Student Resolution Center. And you can, I definitely agree using case management in a situation like that. But if a conflict persists where you're like, I really needed this thing and I can't seem to really communicate with my instructor, conflict resolution folks will be really helpful in that scenario as well. Okay, and so the question from Sam is, how does school grading system work? That is a really good question. So the university, so I think what you're asking is about the grade scale and how the work you do in a class translates to the grade that you receive at the end of the term. So the complicated thing about that is every class works differently in terms of how different assignments are weighted, how much they're worth, in other words. And then ultimately how those grades altogether produce the final grade. But they are all similar in the sense that at the end of the semester, they all have to translate to a letter grade that includes plus or minuses, but goes down a traditional scale of A plus being the highest mark, A plus, A minus, B plus, B minus, C plus, C minus, D, and F. And so just to be aware that that's one of those questions that you're going to need to really ask at the beginning of the semester, especially when you're handed your syllabus at the beginning of a course. And so I think this is one of those moments where asking when you get into class, how am I going to get my final grade? That's a really standard question that every instructor should be able to answer. Okay, there's a question about Rate My Professor. So I saw about a professor in Rate My Professors and heard from existing students and just worried about taking this course. So that's not necessarily an academic integrity related issue. I can just tell you that as a former professor, I'm sure Bronwyn has some ideas on this one. And I would defer to her on how to manage, kind of who's appearing in your course. As a former professor, keep in mind that like Rate My Professors is entirely, people can write whatever they want. There's no one checking to see if any of it's true. I think that this is why we have the course withdrawal process and the drop add period, is that you have a chance to kind of go in and see what they're going to be like and ask questions. And if it just doesn't look like it's going to work for you, you can go find another class.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So it seems like we are through with the questions. I really appreciate all the students for being here and for listening and asking some really great questions. Joseph, thank you for presenting and sharing this really important information. I followed up with someone who asked about this, but after this session is done, we'll start processing this. We'll edit out some of the beginning stuff and some of the end stuff. And then we'll post it on our YouTube link, post it on our orientation page, and I will be sharing it out with all of our new students. So if you want to refer back to it, you will have that link. It will probably be this weekend or by Monday. So just give it a little bit of time. I can't do it immediately after this, but you'll have it within a couple of days. Otherwise, thank you. It does look like there's maybe another question. If you're done and you don't have any other questions, feel free to leave. If you have any questions, pop them in really quickly before we head off. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on Tuesday at the mandatory half-day orientation and Monday at our optional events.
Yeah,
I
thanks
think
everyone. Thanks for coming.
Scholarship questions, that would be something you would check with financial aid. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, Joseph. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Go Rams.